he's reputed to have called this area a hornet's nest.
A hornet's nest of rebellion.
It's
Right,
a hornet's
right,
nest.
right. Welcome into Local Roots. I'm Alicia Barnes. If you've ever wondered about the fascination Charlotte has with the Hornets, like why our NBA team is named the Charlotte Hornets, so we're going to take a deeper dive today into the history, and it starts with the Revolutionary War, the time period between 1775 and 1783. Welcome in again to Local Roots. So we have two distinguished guests today. I want to introduce them to you to help us walk through all this very interesting history. First, we have urban historian Dr. Tom Hanchett with History South, a regular here on Local Roots. So thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
And also Dr. Hugh Dusick. You are a history professor at Central Piedmont Community College, and we are so excited to be able to have you here to talk through us all this history as to how it kind of relates to Charlotte and the Charlotte Hornets. It's quite interesting, quite fascinating.
Glad to be here.
Okay, let's start off with kind of take us through the time period that you think we'll start with looking at, we said, in the 1700s.
Okay, yeah, so, well, why do we get to Charlotte and the Hornets and this quote that supposedly comes from Lord Charles Cornwallis about the Hornets? Well, actually, we have to kind of go back a little bit further than 1775, back to the French and Indian War, which was some decades before, and the war between Britain and France, which had an American component and cost the British government a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And the British government decided that they wanted to tax the American colonists who had benefited somewhat from the war, and instituted efforts to tax the colonies, such as a stamp tax, and then the notorious tax on tea, which ended up with the Boston Tea Party.
Okay.
And then as this revolutionary protest swirled around the American colonies, the British government sent over the forces, the troops and the Navy, to quell the rebellion, to squash it. And it didn't work out in the North. Fell to pieces at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And so we came up with Plan B, which was to subjugate the South. And that was at first very successful in South Carolina in early 1780. And on September the 26th, 1780, Lord Charles Cornwallis and a British army marched into Charlotte, North Carolina. And that's where the story proceeds.
That's where it kind of starts us off. Dr. Tom Hanchett, I know it's like certain pieces of that I can remember that I learned when I was in the 5th and 6th grade. Fill in the gaps a little bit.
Well, there are two periods when the Charlotte is really part of this revolutionary thing, even though we're a little tiny town. Maybe 20 houses here along what's now Tryon Street, the old Indian trading path. And early on, when things are starting to swirl up north, we look at that and we go, well, we really don't want to be British subjects. And so there's a debate whether there's a Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence in May 20th of 1775. In reality, most historians would tell you that there was Mecklenburg Resolves in a little bit later in May of 1775. Mm-hmm. And both of those, the resolves are published in the newspaper. They talk about the authority of the king and crown being null and void, which is just a powerful statement. So that's the beginning. And then, as Professor Dusick was saying, towards the end, they didn't know it was, but the end of the revolution, they send over Cornwallis from England, and just sort of like Putin sending in the troops to Ukraine, they assumed that everybody here was British and would just come out and love on Mr. Cornwallis, and instead they shot at him.
Right.
He walked down Tryon Street with his troops, and they shot at him. He went over to Kings Mountain, and they shot at him. He eventually packed up and went up to Yorktown, where George Washington shot at him, and that was the end of the revolution. So that's a kind of quick overview of some of the ways that this town was active in its. It was so small, but it was active in the revolution.
Dr. Dusick, when you talk to your students
Yes.
on the college level, what are some of the things that you really bring home of things that we need to be able to know, and why the history is so important?
I like to bring this up, and I always like to refer to this whole story about the American Revolution and what happened because as a British person living in America, I like to bring this up because you can see two sides to this story. You can see the side of the loyalists who had a very good reason for staying loyal. This was the traditional form of government, and who knows what's going to happen after the revolution. Mm-hmm. And you can see on the other side, the revolutionaries, especially after the publication of Common Sense, 1776, you can see how that they had very good reasons to be on the side of the revolution. So I like to bring this up with my students and say, well, you can look at pretty much any issue and you can see different perspectives on it. And so that's my...
Go a little deeper. What are some of the perspectives that you've heard?
About the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm. Just from different sides. I never thought about that, too, in terms of somebody being from the UK and then also living here in America.
Well, sort of as a British person living over here, not all that dissimilar. The United States and Great Britain, we're really rather similar. But actually, we don't. As far as the Revolutionary War goes, over in the UK, I don't really talk about it very much at all. Actually, it's sort of like
don't have tea and talk about the Revolutionary
War.
No,
we've got other great things that we like to talk about, such as Horatio Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Nelson's column defeating the French, and that's what we talk about.
That's funny.
So the Revolutionary War, it's a sort of bottom of page 475, a footnote.
Wow. Dr. Hanchett, so let's bring us to like maybe 1780 in Charlotte, so people can understand like what was it like? What was the people in terms of all of where we were going, of what was happening? Kind of set the tone for that.
This was the backcountry. This was far from the coast, and at that point, the main transportation for anything, any goods, any people, was boats. And so you wanted to be in Charleston, or you wanted to be in Richmond, which was as far inland as you could go in Virginia on the James River. Here we were above the fall line, above where the rivers get rocky, waterfalls. You can't run a boat back and forth. It's one of the reasons why Charlotte is not on the Catawba River. Downtown Charlotte is about 10 miles from the big waterway here, but it was a kind of piddling little waterway because it was rocky. It had the waterfalls, such like that. So what you had here were early European settlers. A lot of them were Scots-Irish Presbyterians. They were people who were religiously not in love with the Queen. Mm-hmm. There was a state religion, which became the Episcopal Church, and Presbyterians had wanted to get away from that. That's the reasons they came to the world. But they also wanted to be a courthouse town. If you were the courthouse town for this new county of Mecklenburg, then people would come and trade at your doorstep, and people liked that. So that is how they chose the name Charlotte, wife of King George III of England. The person who made the decision was William Tryon, the colonial governor, Tryon Street. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Queen Charlotte was from Mecklenburg in Germany, and so we are a Mecklenburg County. But all of that is just being invented here in the late 1700s. The first settlers that show up in colonial records are in 1768 in what's now Charlotte. And so this is, you talk about it being a footnote to the great history of the British Empire. It really was. It was very important to us. It was very important to what became the United States, but it wasn't that important. If you think of grand battles with thousands of people, nope, that wasn't it.
So what is important is, of course, having this connection between how we have the Charlotte Hornets and the Hornets with all of this history and how it kind of connects together. So we're going to talk about that next, take a little bit of a break right now, but stay with us here on Local Roots. I'm Alicia Barnes, and if you've enjoyed this episode of Local Roots, you can watch all of our original programming by downloading our Queen City News Plus app. It's free to download, and you just search Queen City News Plus on your Roku, Amazon Fire Stick, Apple TV, or Samsung TV. Now let's get back to the episode. Welcome back into Local Roots. So we're talking about the Battle of Charlotte, the date September 26, 1780. I'm going to start with Dr. Hanchett. Kind of walk us through, set the tone as to what was going on and how this relates and why it's important here for the Charlotte history.
Well, the British had been fighting since about 1775, and they were getting tired. And they sent a fresh general over, Lord Cornwallis, came into Charleston, which was the big port in the South, and then kind of swept up through the backcountry. And the idea was that as he went, people would come out and they would give him flowers because they were British subjects. They would just love on him, and they didn't. But he got up to Charlotte and actually marched down Tryon Street when the really bad stuff started to happen.
All right, Dr. Dusick.
Okay.
Walk us through it as the troops walked in.
Well, as far as Cornwallis was concerned, he'd got South Carolina under control. At least he thought he had. So when he came into town with this, you can imagine on that day, Charlotte was just a very tiny place with a courthouse right there in the middle of Trade and Tryon, right in the middle of a street there. Mm. And it was a frame building with a stone wall underneath, and there's a few houses around. And you can imagine this army of thousands of British redcoats and the green coats, the British cavalry, the British Legion, the dragoons, as well as wagons, this huge group of people moving up towards Charlotte. Now, around the courthouse was William R. Davy and about 150 patriots. Now, they weren't expecting to win the battle against this huge army, but they were going to slow him down. Mm-hmm. So as they came into Charlotte, most people had left. It was very probably they were just there, very quiet. And then they're coming into Charlotte, and then, on that day, the British Legion, the cavalry, the greencoats, the dragoons, they were usually led by the notorious Bannister Tarleton, but he was sick, and so it was led by a fellow called George Hanger, who was an impetuous young aristocrat who, instead of reconnoitering the town as he'd been told to do, went charging in with the greencoats and was met with withering fire by William R. Davy and the Patriots. And he went charging out again. And so this happened about 3 times. And at one point, Lord Cornwallis was so frustrated, he goes up to them and he says, referring to their string of recent victories, he says, "Legion, remember, you have everything to lose and nothing to gain." Oh, okay. Now that got their attention. And they went in with the infantry and pushed out the Patriots and chased them up the Salisbury Road, which is North Tryon. Cornwallis then went back to town and set up his camp and his headquarters right here in Charlotte. And this is where he stayed for a couple of weeks.
And didn't he have some words that he said that's how we got to the Hornets in the Hornets' nest?
Well, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. The thing about that is he's reputed to have called this area a hornet's nest.
A hornet's nest of rebellion.
It's
right,
a hornet's
right,
nest.
right.
But the trouble is, as speaking on behalf of historians, we can't find a primary source. We can't find any actual documentation he ever said it or wrote it anywhere. Mm. Now, it goes all the way back to about 1800, where John McNitt Alexander, who'd been involved in the revolutionary activities here in Charlotte, he reports that Cornwallis said this, but we can't actually find anywhere an actual documentation of Cornwallis saying it. But he did make other disparaging comments about the community.
Right, because that's exactly as Dr. Hanchett said, that the quote, a hornet's nest of rebellion, for it to be a quote, very interesting to find out that we can't source it.
No, we can't source it. But
boy, do we love it.
But,
I mean, it's that rebellious thing that Americans think of themselves.
And we've held on to that here in Charlotte.
That's right. And even if he didn't say it, he probably would have agreed with it because he had a very difficult time here in Charlotte. And eventually, after hearing the news of the loss at King's Mountain over towards the west, where Patrick Ferguson and his loyalists were routed by the Over Mountain men, he retreated out of Charlotte on a cold, windy day and got lost in the woods.
Ended up to Greensboro people in Greensboro shot at him, ended up in Yorktown, and that's where George Washington finished him off. So Greensboro probably would claim that they had a bigger play in that. But it helped that he just kept getting beat up on. And Charlotte was part of that history. It really was.
That's right.
What I find to be so fascinating is, as we're showing you pictures here of the Charlotte Hornets, the video, as you said, we hold on to that. We kept getting beat up upon. It's almost like what we go through as with our Charlotte Hornets that we see. I was at the game last night. A tough loss because it came down to the very end. But Dr. Hinchett, fill in the gaps just a little bit so people can get excited. I mean, of course, we said that we can't source this quote, but we have now. You see all over the Queen City, it's all about the Hornets.
It is something that we really have embraced. The Girl Scout Council is the Hornets Nest Girl Scout Council. If you are driving up next to a blue and white police car, look closely at the logo. There's a Hornets Nest in the logo.
Really?
Of course, the NBA basketball team. And I keep trying this. Fellow historians kind of go, yeah, but I think we should be naming ourselves not after Cornwallis, who's British, but after George Washington, father of our country. George Washington came through Charlotte right after the Revolution, 1791.
Okay.
Stayed at a little tavern. That's all there were. There wasn't a Motel 6. There wasn't a Hampton Inn. There was just a little tavern, and he stayed there. He got up the next morning, and he wrote in his diary, we see this.
Yeah, this is
He wrote that Charlotte was a trifling place. In other words, not much. But can you imagine it? Instead of the Charlotte Hornets
every time you hear the word
team,
trifling, it's always a bad thing.
The Charlotte Trifles basketball team, wouldn't it? No,
it doesn't.
No. To me, the Hornets, even if you don't know the history, you always think a hornet. It's the sting, the buzz, the annoyance, the always around. I mean, there's so many adjectives you can think of when you think of a hornet.
That's what it was. That's what wore down poor old Cornwallis and his army, was these innumerable skirmishes around this area here, where you had one or two large battles, yes, but it was like all the time, constantly wearing him down, and he had while he was here in Charlotte, he couldn't get supplies, he couldn't get messages in or out. They really were the Hornets who were just buzzing around and causing him all kinds of troubles. So you always hear a lot about what happened up in the north, and then you hear about Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown, but the bit in between was in places such as Charlotte and this area here, where he was just worn down by, and his army was worn down by this constant struggle with the patriots in the area.
Is that what, when we talk about the 1780 skirmish, that brings that into play? That's the period you're talking about?
This period, the 1780s, from about 1775 onwards, when this area shifted from being loyal to the crown, and they thought that would work when they called it Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, to be getting involved in the revolutionary activity.
This conversation's so interesting. We're going to take a bit of a break right here, but come back with so much more on Local Roots. All right, so we welcome you back into Local Roots right now. We've been talking a lot about the period of 1780. I want to kind of roll it back a little bit. And Dr. Hinchett, I'm going to look to you to kind of bring us up to speed as to where we were, the time period that we need to really kind of make sure we get in this conversation.
I want to talk about the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, which didn't exist, and also the Mecklenburg Resolves, which did. This is before the Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia, 1776, July 4th, all of that. Before that, there's a lot of unrest in the colonies. Paul Revere is doing his thing up in New England. And as it becomes clear that Britain is not respecting people here in the New World, they say, we're going to create our own nation. And that becomes the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But before that, there are little kind of outbreaks. In Halifax, North Carolina, there's something called the Halifax Resolves, which they basically say, we don't want to be English anymore. We want to be independent. Here in Charlotte, there's a claim that the very first of those small declarations happened on May 20th, 1775. Unfortunately, there's no evidence for that. None at all. When people were making history, they were busy making history and planting their crops and fighting battles and getting their kids into college or whatever. You're busy. And many decades later, I think in the early 1800s, folks said, "Grandpa, didn't you sign some kind of revolutionary paper back in, when was it, 75? It was 70. But there's no evidence of May the 20th. There is, in the newspapers and the colonial records, something called the Mecklenburg Resolves, which declared that the authority of the king and crown was null.
Wow.
And so that statement, which is now corroborated through newspaper research, colonial records, you can see the statue of Captain James Jack, who carried those papers to Philadelphia. All of that is part of the early Revolutionary War history, Charlie.
That's right. The document, supposedly the document signed on May the 20th, was lost in a fire in 1800 at the home of John McNitt Alexander. But probably the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, the actual text, is an effort to reconstruct what they could remember of the original document from many years before, and this, which was the Mecklenburg Resolves. It's been a controversy since the 19th century, and people have been discussing this and writing about it, and whatever happened, certainly we can say that by that period, by 1775, the community, the whole of the community, the Scots-Irish, the German-speaking people, even the Catawba, African-Americans as well, were involved in the revolutionary activities. It really was a hotbed of rebellion.
You've answered all my questions. What else do people need to know as we wrap up this episode of Local Roots? And if you have any extra resources that you'd like to be able to...
Well, I brought along a wonderful book by a historic preservation activist in Charlotte, Dan Morrill. And this is...
Angle that a little bit more this way. Perfect.
Way.
Right. There we go.
Mm-hmm. And this is a good, quick history of Charlotte with some good information on the Revolutionary War. Charlotte has gone through many reinventions, and that's a powerful thing. It was a trifling place, as George Washington said in the 1780s, 1790s. What really opened the door to development was the railroads, the new technology of the 1850s. Charlotte became a major railroad center. All of that allowed cotton to be grown here in the years after slavery, textile mills to be built here. The textile mill wealth is what created the banks, and today we're the second largest banking center in the United States. So it's hard to imagine that the revolution happened in part here, but it did. And it helped set the stage for subsequent reinventions. And of course, we're in the middle of another one.
I think this is why we could call this a revolutionary city. If people come here to Charlotte and they see this wonderful city with the beautiful buildings, this flourishing economy, they think it must have sprung up yesterday. But if you look around Charlotte, you can see plaques in the sidewalks. You can see there were buildings, as Dr. Hanchett said, but Charlotte has reinvented itself several times, been through gold mining and textiles and banking, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. So looking back to the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence or the Charlotte Hornets and the origin of the Hornets quote, you can see that Charlotte really has a revolutionary history. We are a revolutionary city.
Dr. Dusick, Dr. Hanchett, thank you so much for being here with us, and we hope you enjoyed this edition of Local Roots. We'll see you next on Local Roots for our next edition.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.